Okay, so I talked about some of my current funding, and today I'll talk a bit about my KL1 award, which I have an additional year on, and I'm actually working on my second aim. So I want to highlight that NHGRI over the past few years has really focused on trying to integrate and embed more health equity into their RFAs. So this is just to give you an example of an RFA that really focuses on health equity and metrics and thinking about health equity across the genomic life cycle. And I recently submitted an R01 that really addresses and hopefully aligns with this RFA. I won't talk specifically about the about my study other than just a general overview. But again, this is just to highlight that there are funding mechanisms that allow us to do ethical, legal, and social implications work. Thinking about access to high quality genomics information, development of technology, testing, as well as acceptability of genomic approaches and interventions. And Vanessa's work is directly aligned with this, and I think thinking about other subpopulations and populations that are especially vulnerable to genomics research is an important part of this. So just generally, I'll highlight that my current work study with colleagues at Baylor is thinking about the ethical, legal, and social implications of engaging women and families who just experienced stillbirth, and thinking about ways to be respectful and sensitive to collect genetics information, genomic information at a very vulnerable point in time. So we need this information because we're trying to understand more about the genetic etiology of stillbirth, which we don't know a lot about. We also know that populations such as Black and minority women, minoritized women are disproportionately affected by stillbirth. So understanding more about the genetics underpinnings of that is important. So I'll just highlight some general ethical considerations of viewing the stillbirth genomics work. Um, we know that this requires meeting people at an especially vulnerable moment. There are later points in time that can work in terms of collecting this data, but immediately after is an ideal situation. It also, you think about approaching people when they don't have a lot of information about fetal tissue sampling, autopsy. Sometimes there's misinformation. People believe that there is a cost for autopsy post stillbirth, and there's not. So again, a lot of importance of coordination between genetics counselors, OBGYNs, other types of providers, and of course, having people that do ethics work to think about how to do this respectfully. And then something that I learned in the process, one of the research team members, interviewers, said that they would not be doing the interviews because they had their own experience with stillbirth. So we talked about this earlier, trauma and secondary trauma. So how can we make sure that that's being considered as people are interviewing and engaging with populations that have just experienced stillbirth? So I went back and this is all for Renessa's study, and I had a little PTSD. So I went back to an earlier study when I'm thinking about like the evolution of my ethical, legal, and social implications related work. And this is something that I have not published, and I'll talk about why. And Celia was actually involved in the earlier stages, but I was super interested in understanding more about how women living with HIV experience participating in large-scale studies and what were their understandings around biobanking and genomics. I was super hyped, and I just assumed that this would be my whole career trajectory. So I'll highlight a study from a few years ago that I did focusing on women's views around biobanking, but I used a convenient sample, women from the Women's Interagency HIV study, across several places, and these women had already participated in a biobank. Um, so the reason I chose this population, honestly, a study staff came up to me and said, hey, I don't think people really understand these informed consent documents. I think there is actually too much trust that they place in investigators. So we hear a lot about distrust and mistrust. This person felt like there was over trust in research staff because these people had been enrolled in the study for so long. They just assumed that everyone that was delivering the interventions was focused on their well-being. So she wanted me to think about ways to develop an empirical ethical study. That's what I did. And then everything just kind of hit the fan after that. So what we found out after collecting this data, we administered an additional survey with some validated questions around genomics, perceptions, harms, informational needs, all the things. And one of the important findings was that 98% of women consented to genetics testing earlier in the biobanking, and 77% of women stated that they would participate in a biobank if asked. So that's a good finding. But 16% reported ever being asked to take part in a biobank, and 12% reported participating in a biobank. So that was alarming for a lot of the investigators, and a lot of pushback around, how do you publish this? Like, it means that people didn't understand that they were consenting to a biobank. And then I just got really stressed out and I just left it alone. But I am very interested in thinking about revisiting this, and because I think it's an important finding and it has implications for, and we talk a lot about the scientific validity, but people wonder, like, what if you publish this? What's going to happen? What is NIH going to say when they return to a study where people didn't even realize they were enrolled in a biobank? It is important.
I mean, I get the complexities, especially if they were your colleagues, right?
I mean, it's a lot of layers to whys, so
Right.
that's a little, different. And there are gatekeepers, and I mean, maybe at this point in my career, I will feel a little more comfortable. Like,
Right.
Yeah.
but yeah, it was
Right.
definitely tricky, and then I was just like, okay. So
I mean, we have a biobank consent
Whoops.
in my study, and now I'm like super concerned that people didn't understand what that meant. Like, I think my staff does a great job consenting, but what if they didn't?
Were they, was it literally just like sign on the line, or did they select from options like,
Did
yes,
they
I
have
agree to
options?
do this, yes, I agree to do this, but not this, no, I don't agree to do
they have
either?
options, yeah.
I feel like
it
people-
just gave a review of like what, and we've talked about NIH's All of Us has very, this was prior to that.
Well, and how complicated was the rest of the study? So that the biobank is like,
Just the part.
a
of
minor.
it. Yeah, just the
Some
part, a
sentences.
larger, yeah.
and subjects, as an aside, subjects have told me, we go through all the risks, clinical trial of a drug. This could happen, this could happen. Oh, and there's a risk of death. And I had a participant say, why is that only one short sentence?
At the end.
You might get an infection from your blood draw is an entire paragraph. So that's how complicated was the rest of the study
And each time,
versus a biobank
right.
study where that's the focus of
And they,
the
and they,
Why?
yeah, and they
Yeah.
should be reconsented, and that's something that doesn't happen, like,
Yeah.
different parts of the study, it's not like each time they come in for the genetics,
continuous.
there's a continuous
process, yeah.
conversation, so,
Yeah.
yeah, there were,
Yeah.
some issues with that, but anyway, there were multiple levels, sensitivity required to engage study, so what happens if we find out that women did not understand? This was an earlier question, we already have IRB approval, and then based on Celia's work and what she's found in terms of communicating with investigators, that it's important to really focus on the scientific validity piece and the scientific relevance. And of course, I'm still dealing with how can I publish this work, because I really care about this work and I think it's important.
I would say, if you go back to the slide, one of the other slide,
slide?
I don't know.
Uh-huh.
One of the positive aspects is they said they would.
They would,
Right, so even though only 16% knew they did, or
Yeah.
12%, at least, if you look at, you could do a chi-square or whatever it is, to look at the percent that would, I think that's a little positive,
Yeah.
right? I think also we're talking, I think we mentioned this a little while ago, but in terms of informed consent, there's immediate understanding, and then there's long-term, the salience of that particular item, right? And so it doesn't mean that they didn't understand it
They might not
necessarily,
remember.
but they might not remember because it was not the important part.
Yeah.
They were, they weren't even involved in that part, really.
Yeah.
So they're just thinking about the direct kinds of experiences they had. So, I'm not necessarily sure it's totally negating the
Okay.
efficacy of the informed consent.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's helpful.
I think the most important part of the study actually is not the finding, it's that we were uncomfortable publishing it. Because this is not surprising to me, that I'm sure that in my Apple terms of service for my phone, I've consented to a biobank. I don't read, I don't retain it. I think universally from day one, people consent to things that either they don't pay that much attention, they've decided they're gonna be in your, for the most part, they're gonna be in your study based on you're nice, or they understand whatever. So it's not at all I don't think, I'd be shocked if any researcher was surprised by this finding, but that somehow the research environment is that it's risky to actually publish it. That's,
I mean, I think I mentioned this before, but when I did a study on pediatric cancer with adolescents and their parents, all of whom had been in a study, the majority of them didn't know that they had been in a study. So that didn't mean that informed consent, it was that their child was treated, it was months afterwards, the kid improved, that's not what, they weren't thinking about the fact that the researcher came and asked them if they wanted to do this add-on, right? Which, to cancer, and I put it in the article.
And I think, and I guess the thing I've been thinking about with my own, I just sold a house and bought a house, and I didn't read anything. I'm just like, I literally would text my realtor, "Am I good?"
biobank now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Like,
right.
am I like, I'm not gonna read it, like, I don't have time, but like, do you understand he's everything legit? He's like, yeah, and I'm like, sign, and that's it, because I trust him.
Yeah, in my
Doesn't
MRP,
Exactly.
I mean, people were raised significant concerns about almost all of the data activities that they had already granted
Right.
the rights to from the app that I recruited them from.
So I have a confession. I don't want to confess, but I will confess because when I had the tumor in the jaw and they talked about that there were certain areas in the world they're seeing people who came from having this type of tumor, and they asked if I would join a biobank, and they gave me all the paperwork. I said yes, I signed. I didn't even have my glasses on, so I thought nothing. Like I was like, oh, where's the signature line?
So
They pointed
anxious.
to me, and I just signed it immediately.
Yeah.
And also, I was having a biopsy done, and I didn't even know that was what they were planning on doing at the next appointment. I just knew it was a show up. Like I was so just wanting to get this cured and all this stuff, and I trusted, and I thought about it after, and I was like, oh my god, like this is awful. Like I should have.
Because it's relational, because you're in need in that case, but you trust the person that's
Well, and I wanted
offering you, right.
that answer. Like, oh,
Yeah.
so you guys may find some genetic.
Yeah.
Sure, fine. Like I don't want anyone else to go through this.
So maybe this is like a place where like specific guidance around how best to consent could be really helpful. So like
like
Sue's point about like ongoing consent is necessary, like doing it separate consent, making sure that people are like literally walking folks through that
Yeah.
apart from other, I mean, I think that kind of
Video
guidance.
consent, talk
Yeah.
back.
An
Language,
opportunity to
language.
like really
I mean, you
elaborate.
use biobanking when you first did the study.
Yeah.
Yeah, like what's that mean?
That changed, that term
Yeah.
was.
Yeah, and I think the way, like when I sort of like in my study, I gave like a whole overview of what a biobank was, which may have sounded a little different than what, I mean, but it
Right,
was
that's a
clearer.
good
It was
point.
definitely more clear than a biobank is this, but if they didn't receive that information, they're like, oh, this is new.
Yeah.
So there's
The other
that.
one just said they were gonna keep some of my stuff.
Yeah, they're gonna
Yeah.
store
Later
some of
use,
it.
and I said, yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I mean, there is one part of WISE that I think, it's been a while, and I'm assuming they still do this, like when they would do drug testing, hair was like a big thing, because mostly Black women, they're like, don't cut my hair. So there was some so I think if there was some sort of like recall, like, oh, remember when we took a piece of your hair, that was for like a genomics test, they would probably remember that a bit more than, yeah.
No.
Yeah, so, okay, this is, yeah.
So, what I'm wondering about is how this all falls along with like using people's health record data for research too. Because like if I want the university, so I'm at University of Chicago, and so we have a big central data warehouse of all the people that have come through our EMR. And if I wanted to say, of these 10 million people, do people on Crestor or Lipitor do better in terms of something? And then you have a big panel and you can look, but I don't know who any of them are. But it's still data from individuals that have built this. process. And I think that's, again, that's kind of like you're saying in the terms and conditions, you sign all this stuff when you go into a
You
hospital.
sign the HIPAA and who cares?
Yeah, and you sign the, the consent for treatment, and in our consent for treatment, it says that your data might be used by researchers, but they won't be able to identify you without your permission.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, like, are there similarities there? And what were you doing, like, what was the goal of having the biospecimens?
So the biospecimens were already collected. I just wanted to understand what they understood.
What was the research?
Like, what were they
Oh,
doing with the,
parent
like,
research.
why did
What's
they
the
collect
parent
them in the first
research?
Oh, okay, a lot of it is around drug interactions.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, and
like
They'll do-
precision
they'll
medicine,
do anything.
anything, yeah. Yeah, all kinds of different types of, and it says different types of studies, and it does talk about like going into the broad consent. That's kind of how it's described, like you may not be able to remove your data. I'll have to go back to that informed consent document, but yeah.
Some of it also is that question of, is it for good or could they be misused, right? That's the concern that people have, is how is that gonna be used? And is it gonna be used in a bad way versus in a good way? I mean, I remember being so shocked in the beginning of the HIV work that we had all this blood from gay men from years before, so we could see that HIV was actually around in the 70s, or at least that. And we wouldn't have known that without sort of that, and how do you kind of highlight what the benefits might be? Because so much focus is on the misuse and.
Right. And that's what your study is gonna, like, when you think about different populations and what's important to them, so people, there are specific reasons why.
Yeah, and if you're getting, well, we can talk about this later, but if you're getting panicked, the but the questions can also be, how would you like, there is some research on this, how would you like the genetic information to be used? What are ways you would not want it to be used?
Yeah.
Which can
What
really
are the
inform
benefits?
biobanks.
And like, what kind of limitations would you
Right,
like?
exactly.
Yeah.
would
I mean,
you
especially
like?
like, would you allow them to be used for commercial purposes, I think is a big one.
Or would you
right.
want them to be in a study on racial differences, or, something like, you know what I mean, something like that, or, looking for the LGBT gene, right?
violence gene.
Because there have been a few studies on that, asking people what they would prefer.
Yeah.
And, most of them, if it's about health, they all agree. That's really great,
And you're doing qualitative, so this was quantitative, so you have an opportunity to get more information,
Yeah, but I think that might work.
Did you ask them, by the way, Faith, if when knowing what they know now, whatever that is, they would consent for it again?
No. I think there was just a question that just said, would you, after explaining it, would you participate in a biobank?
70-some-odd%.
But I see what
yes.
you're saying, like if you, just having maybe one at the end.
I just wonder because I think we were like, oh my God, people don't remember, but that doesn't mean that they're
they
harmed
would
by not
change
remembering,
their
that they
mind.
would change.
Right, exactly.
That's what
That's the
Celia's
thing.
saying, All right, so the genomics research is always, so the sort of my current study, working on my K, and I'll just highlight just kind of a few things about the process. And this has actually been interesting for me because I was in Birmingham, then I went to Houston, and then the pandemic made it challenging to do this work, which was really proposed as community engaged work. And how do you do that at the height of a pandemic? So I was able to get a little bit more time to finish doing this. I made a few trips to Macon County, and I've talked to some people about their experiences doing genetics. All of us is actually not yet recruiting in Macon County, but people are aware. So I'll just talk a little bit about some of the work that I've done there. I started off thinking that I would do community advisory boards in the beginning to get a sense of how to approach it, and actually someone that I was working with said, oh, you should do community engaged studios, which is a little more intensive in terms of engaging and asking questions and sort of planning and implementing the study. And we started off, we did several community engagement groups, and this was an earlier group. Macon County, Tuskegee also has a community advisory, well, they have their own IRB, which was established during the pandemic because they stated that people from other institutions were coming in trying to collect genetics. So then they started to create their own body, which I think is great. And they're they probably need a bit more funding and support and infrastructure to continue. But given the history, having a community or an institutional review board is very important. So definitely benefits to conducting community engagement studios. I actually didn't lead them. I was there. We hired someone who has experience. She's done a lot of work with the Vanderbilt community doing this, doing community engaged studios. And I think it's also nice to have a person that's more neutral when you're thinking about doing this work. So just a few sample questions. What concerns do you have about genomics? What are some perceptions of benefits? What should the public know? How should we return results to the community? And we got a lot of information in the process of analyzing, getting things transcribed right now, but just from our debriefings, some things that came up, it's just like we need truth and healing and a lot of historical just facts came up, of course, around the United States syphilis study at Tuskegee. Again, this is at Tuskegee in Tuskegee, so there's going to be more conversations around trustworthiness and distrust. They talked a lot about this community being left behind and needing more infrastructure, more health resources, and the fact that people always want to do research there but don't leave anything behind. Not funding, not training, not education. So very serious about the importance of sustainability.
All I can do is think of the Tuskegee study and you talking about a community that's still actively feeling that, and now we really just don't know where we come from, who we belong to, and so we've got to then trust them to tell us how to get to where we want to get, and I just don't trust them. I'm just going to be honest. I just don't trust somebody of another race to tell me where I come from.
So we're talking about, genetics, genomics testing and the concerns around that. Yeah.
Oh, I see.
Next one.
Thinking about the history.
Yeah.
Like this,
Yeah.
I see. Country.
But folks here, in my view, in the Macon County area, they like to see results. You know, in other words, if I participate, give me some feedback to say this is, whether it's good or bad, whatever it is, give me some results, because they're not, in my opinion, familiar with the research procedure that's taking place. And you and I know it could be 5-10 years before the research conclude, anything that they're going to be able to certify to say this is official, especially FDA. It takes a long time to get stuff done. But the attitude is the trust that we need for our individuals to actually perform any of these research is need to be perpetuated through, I think, our educational system.
Yeah, so there were there's a lot of rich, interesting information and suggestions and recommendations, even when we didn't ask for it, because people are very attuned to the nuances of research in this area.
Could you put it back in presentation mode, please?
So concluding our, I can, So when we talk about building relationships and doing this work, two of the participants were brothers and they owned a farm. They invited us and we just learned so much in the process. And actually, this is my Twitter post about elders schooled me and then fed me. Well, throughout the study, when I was using shorthand, when I would speak and I would just say syphilis study, they're like, no, like this happened like multiple times. And I've always been taught that it's okay to call it the syphilis study, but they're like, you can say the whole thing. United States Public Health Service syphilis study. At Tuskegee. So that was super interesting because the person on the end, closest, she was super like calling me out. So, so in the same visit, we took some people that came on our team to the Tuskegee University Legacy Museum, which was established a few years ago. And again, all of this really ties into when we think about the history of the studies. And the museum has actually, interesting part about this is they haven't received enough funding to process all the archives. There's a lot of information that hasn't even been published or displayed because of the lack of infrastructure and resources around this. So this is Cynthia Wilson. She's actually one of the people that gave commentary for the Rolling Stone. She's an archivist who's been leading the work, but very much short-staffed. Ironically, when we left, a few days after that, we noticed that the National Library of Medicine released all of these documents from the syphilis study. And
To them? To who?
just
Oh, just
online,
online.
widely, yeah. So it's available, you can go online, you can click, you can see the checks that were written out from the study for the burial services. Millbank has taken responsibility because they did their own audit and realized that Millbank actually funded the burial and autopsies through the study. And so there's a lot that's been happening. Susan Rubberby is one of the historians who was involved and wrote a lot about Tuskegee in the past, spent some time there. So again, a very interesting time when we talk about trustworthiness, releasing this information. So the question that I had along with other colleagues, and we wrote a Hastings Center commentary, thinking about what's the opportunity now when we release these historical materials, what's the obligation of bioethicists, other historians, archivists, to really make sure that this information is presented in a way that's respectful, just, and ethical. So some of the considerations we brought up, again, building off of some of the conversations we had, how should community members be informed, engaged? What about interdisciplinary expertise when we think about archival work? So we're talking about restoring trust and not perpetuating untrustworthiness, but if you're releasing documents without any guidance, which is essentially what has happened, how can we do this in a way, how can we prevent harm from being perpetuated? So these are just some questions, again, based on our knowledge of the communities. We worked with Stephen Shadecki, who is a professor at Tuskegee, also, and all of us ethicists. So in general, I guess to kind of sum this up, bioethicists and ethical, legal, and social implications researchers.
Shira didn't know either.
I had no idea.
We were talking at the back.
No, I'm just playing.
No, it's
They're
fine.
focused on genomics.
Yeah, focused on,
Despite the title.
Yeah, focused on, it is kind of strange, because it's like, what is LC and what?
Yeah.
I thought it was like literally LC.
Me
so,
too,
like,
I
They do.
Right.
NIH does other LC
LC,
areas.
yeah,
Like they did.
LC,
They had
yeah.
all these COVID
Yeah.
LC grants.
Right, but the LC was established through NHGR, but yeah. The LC of wastewater, I mean, it's the same thing. It's, an important piece. There's more efforts to think about populations that have been historically mistreated, underrepresented, and underserved. And I think this gives an opportunity for ethicists to ask the questions that we'd like to ask, even if it's related to genomics. It relates to a lot of other areas, such as HIV, such as wastewater, such as all the work that we've been doing. So that's basically